The arrest of Andrew Tate in Romania for suspected rape and sex offences has intensified the controversy about the social media superstar. He's an icon to schoolboys and young men with his playboy lifestyle and his macho advice on how to strike it rich and attract young women. His opponents, though, see him as a dangerous misogynist who boasts of abusing women and making a fortune by radicalising young men. So, how is this notorious so-called moral entrepreneur and others like him able to exert so much influence? Welcome to the programme. I'm Philip Hampshire. Andrew Tate is hugely popular on social media, particularly among schoolboys and young men. The former kickboxer has 13 billion with a B views on the video sharing app called TikTok. But the message he is sharing is misogynistic, conspiratorial and violent. Critics say he's a textbook case of so-called toxic masculinity. But is he simply part of a trend which includes figures like Jordan Peterson and Joe Rogan, which sees disenfranchised young men seek out role models who harness the power of social media? Joining us on the panel from different parts of the UK, we have in Chester Paul French, who's a lecturer of Criminology at the University of Chester. He's also a PhD researcher at Liverpool's John Moores University. Meanwhile, in Sunderland, Dan Ward is a lecturer in Media and Cultural Studies at the University of Sunderland. And in Coventry, we have Marcus Maloney. He's assistant professor in Sociology at Coventry University. So, first of all, before we get started, gentlemen, thank you very much for joining me today. Let's have a brief run through for the audience who may not be as intimately familiar as we are with who Andrew Tate is. Here exactly is who he is. He is a 36-year-old former professional kickboxer turned notorious, and I use that word advisedly, social media celebrity. With a jet-set lifestyle, he brands himself as the most influential person on the planet, which Kanye West might not be too pleased over. He has 13 billion views on the video sharing app TikTok and close to 5 million on Twitter. Twitter, in fact, banned him for saying that women should bear responsibility for being sexually assaulted. Self-proclaimed misogynist, he calls himself that, and so-called king of toxic masculinity is condemned by critics for his prejudice against women. He says he's an amazing role model who promotes hard work and self-reliance to young men. So, Paul, I'm going to pass it across to you. What fuels a man like Andrew Tate and the various other influencers who are in that genre?
Well, I think it's worthwhile taking from a bit more of a broader perspective, really, to begin with at least, because it is a multifaceted phenomenon, really, is the Tates of the world. So in my research, I tend to look at the hierarchy, so-called hierarchy of credibility in the mainstream, perhaps. So we get our information, what we would deem as credible, traditionally from the likes of political leaders, news outlets, so on and so forth. However, I do argue that the mainstream hierarchy has suffered particularly over the last 2 decades. Massive issues in being able to maintain its credibility, its trustworthiness, owing to, and then just a whole raft of scandals, really. Take your pick: phone hacking scandals, expense scandals, hardships caused by the 2008 crash, more recently cost of living, so on and so forth. So it's corroded public faith. Now, people seek faith. They seek leadership. They seek what they would deem to be credible information. Coinciding this lack of faith over the last couple of decades, this alternative hierarchy, thanks to, I believe, social media, has fueled then the uptake in people like Andrew Tate. People are finding credibility in what he says for a number of reasons, which I'm sure we'll touch upon today. However, I do argue that it is a bit of a mix between what should be credible hierarchy in terms of political leaders and media, shooting themselves in the foot, to put it bluntly, and handing the baton of credibility over to the likes of Andrew Tate.
Dan, do you think that that's exactly what's going on here, or do you have a slightly different take on this? Is there a crisis of masculinity, which is what a man like Andrew Tate would say if I had him here in the studio with me?
Well, I think first and foremost, the thing to point out about this idea of crises of masculinity is that masculinity is generally always in flux. we get these supposed crises occurring every few decades almost. Certainly towards the back end of the 20th century, there was the idea that masculinity was in crisis because of deindustrialization, the loss of traditional male jobs, as well as those communities built around jobs like steelworking, coal mining. In today's world, I would argue that it's quite possible that young men possibly feel under attack. People are clearly more aware of gender inequality in society, historical inequalities, which is clearly a good thing. But to an extent, young men may feel like masculinity in general has been pathologized in contemporary society. So they might feel like they're being asked to atone for almost the sins of their fathers, almost inequalities, privileges of the past that they themselves don't feel that they benefit from.
Now, that's very definitely the perception among a percentage of the population. But Dan, do you think it's an accurate perception or is it a warped perception?
I mean, I think that there is some truth in it to an extent, because I think certainly equality has come on leaps and bounds in terms of women's access to corporate positions, to the workplace, in terms certainly of calling out those sexual abuses of the past with things like the Me Too movement. But I would argue that terms like toxic masculinity, male privilege, which in the past certainly had their uses and applications, have perhaps been extended beyond this to, again, pathologize a whole raft of male behavior. Masculinity in general, for instance, a young man growing up in a post-industrial city like Glasgow or Newcastle, Sheffield, with limited access to work, growing up on a council estate, limited access to education, might quite rightly wonder why they're being tarred with the word privilege by someone who's had that education paid for at Oxford or Cambridge, a middle-class newspaper editor or someone like that. So this idea of privilege, I think male privilege is certainly going to jar with a large proportion of young men growing up today.
Right, well, let me pass across to you, Marcus. I've got to be careful how I phrase this. Marcus, you're an expert in toxic masculinity. It sounds quite bad if I put it that way. So, Marcus, tell me about it. How do you feel about this? Is there such a thing as toxic masculinity at the moment? Is the argument that would be put forward by people like Jordan Peterson, like people like Joe Rogan, that the male half of the human race is under assault in some way? Is that a valid position, as it were?
I mean, one of the problems, I guess, is with with a concept, with a term like toxic masculinity, is that it begins, very useful in terms of understanding the position of men and the sort of actions of men, and then it sort of just takes off, and to some extent it does become a cliche. Which is sort of the natural process, I guess, of a lot of, at one point really useful terms. I mean, yeah, and I mean, this is the point at which I'll sort of echo what's being said. We are absolutely seeing increasing numbers of kind of aggrieved, disenfranchised young men. We need to be clear as well that we're talking predominantly, at least, we're talking about specifically heterosexual young men, and specifically predominantly white heterosexual young men. And I guess one of the kind of weaknesses of people on my side of the sort of ideological fence with this is that it can sort of seem absurd to us, that this historically or empirically or objectively privileged section of society can feel this sense of victimhood or aggrievement. But when you have outcomes like the popularity of Andrew Tate, and obviously to a softer extent, I would sort of say Jordan Peterson is in a similar sort of sphere. We need to take this seriously, however sort of objectively absurd it might seem. And yet, to go to this idea of the crisis of masculinity, I mean, the real problem with that sort of narrative, and as other people have said, Andrew Tate, and as you yourself said at the beginning, Andrew Tate is essentially peddling in an extreme sort of form of that sort of narrative. But the problem with that is, they do sort of identify a real, genuine grievance by a section of society, but then it sets itself against this kind of, nostalgic fantasy of what traditional masculinity was as this sort of great thing that needs to be reclaimed. And if young men can reclaim it, then their problems will be solved. And I think everyone on this panel will hopefully agree that, there's mountains and years of research which show very, very clearly that traditional masculinity was never a particularly healthy thing either for, women, but also for the men who sort of espouse and try to achieve and, fail to achieve traditional masculinity. And I mean that in the sense of, long-term high sort of suicide rates among men, substance abuse rates and harm, not to mention, obviously, also domestic violence and sexual assaults and so on. All of these things are linked to traditional masculinity.
And jail time as well, where men spend a lot more time in jail. Paul, if I can pass it across to you. We were hearing a few minutes ago from Dan about sort of the origins of this is masculinity in decline during the deindustrialization that came through late 70s, early 80s. I hesitate to put it this way, but looking at the rise of everything from AfD, the far-right political group in Germany, through to the likes of Jordan Peterson and Andrew Tate and the rise of them as a public phenomena, is this not an indication that those concerns in the late 70s, early 80s were right? And we're now 40 years down the line, society has been post-industrialized, men can't go out and become lumberjacks and deep-sea divers anymore. You're all going to be accountants doing Excel spreadsheet database entry.
Well, I think and again, this kind of links together that the question you just asked, and perhaps going back a little bit as well to the allure of Andrew Tate. He focuses on problems in society, albeit on a bit of a global perspective. But he seems to have from what I can see, just from again following the likes of who shares his content online through social media websites, they seem to be quite, and I could be wrong on this, but they're quite Western based. So that might narrow down that there's problems, real problems, being felt and perceived at least by men in Western societies. Let's keep it with the UK and the USA for this conversation. So he frames what is hardships being felt by, I believe, quite not just men, but he frames them quite well, quite expertly as being men's issues, caused by, the mainstream, let's say, the matrix, this how I would term as being the traditional hierarchy.
That's a phrase he often uses, the matrix, isn't it?
Exactly, yes. So, it's a reference, really, if we want to put it into more academic terms or just more non-conspiratorial terms. Just the mainstream society is the cause of your hardship. Society and its structures are very much pitted against you. So unless you act in a certain way, you are not going to succeed. You're going to be, as he calls, a brokey all your life. You're not going to be able to attract the caliber of women, the friends, the money, all of that he espouses. So he very much creates an us versus them typology, males, between males and females. And he presents females then as being a bit of a barrier for their femininity and a bit of a barrier for masculinity to come to the fray on an individual basis. And he tries to do this through the demeaning of women. He talks a lot about, I've seen him on a number of podcasts, demeaning women on stereotypes and holding them to double standards, i.e. The female body count, how many sexual partners they've had, being seen as a negative in comparison to males being seen as basically something to be applauded for. So it's the framing of these issues. Do I think that it's a bit of a hangover from, the so-called downfall of industrialization? Yeah, perhaps. However, changes in society aren't felt by men alone. However, if you talk to Andrew Tate, if you talk to supporters, you would nearly think that it is. But we're all going through a cost of living crisis, which is affecting everybody. Changes are occurring. Changes have been occurring, and further changes are needed. And they're not just with men, and they're not just affecting men. They're affecting society as a whole.
Dan, if I can bring this across to you. So what on earth can you do about this? You've got a situation where whether it's a truths, whether it's half-truth, if I had a guest here in the studio, and it'd be very easy for me to do this, who gave me a feminist perspective, she'd probably be using phrases right now like men's tears, white privilege, white male fragility, all of those phrases. I'm sure you're familiar with those phrases and have heard it yourself. So when you have a block of society who is that adamantly, if you like, in antithesis of someone like Andrew Tate, is it not easy for young men, 17, 18-year-old boys, to look at him and go, actually, he's got a good point?
Yeah, of course it is. I think it's the nature of mediated culture today, and in particular social media. Social media thrives on division. It thrives on extreme reactions and polarizing content. You're probably well aware that Facebook's algorithm is manipulated by the content is driven by extreme reactions. So a post getting a like is not as attractive to the algorithm as if it receives an angry react or a cry react or something like that. So it's something that provokes extremes, emotive responses. In that space, when the media and social media increasingly give a platform to the most extreme perspectives on one side of the argument, then inevitably something will step into the vacuum on the other side of things. Clearly, controversy creates cash, and Andrew Tate is someone who jumps on that. Young men will see a polarized point, but the argument being positioned on the other side, and then they'll inevitably seek out someone like Andrew Tate who's stepping into that vacuum on the other side of the extreme instead of seeking moderation.
So, Marcus, how do you deal with that? I mean, this is, if I were to quote one of the lines from Ben-Hur, it's very hard to fight an idea.
What a great line. Well, I should say academics are very good at describing and theorizing problems. Historically, we've never been so good at solving those problems, sadly. I mean, I think if we think in terms of, what Paul's article is all about, which is about establishment sort of voices and leadership. I mean, the question is, what does mainstream society do with an issue like this? I mean, the first thing that I think needs to be said is that, men's health practitioners and mental health practitioners right now are doing a lot of really good work. The problem, or the limits that they have, unfortunately, is that they're always dealing with the aftermath, the sort of the broken stage of this, which, in terms of as a broader social issue, it's sort of too late at that point. I mean, what I can say, I guess, is what I know, or at least feel, doesn't work, and that's sort of moralizing and hectoring from figures of mainstream leadership, as well as, sadly, the sorts of kind of slick kind of mental health marketing campaigns that you see, at least with this particular cohort. They just don't resonate. I mean, they do remind me of those sort of don't do drug kids campaigns that you would get at school or whatever. I think the most positive sort of shoots that I'm seeing actually are also coming from alternative sort of new media forms from the left. So you have, in America, for example, you have figures like, and they're sort of divisive figures themselves, but guys like Hassan Piker, Chapo Trap House in America. I think Novara Media here in Britain do some really good work, but I think it's actually it is the internet that's going to sort of push back and the other ideological side, and you see some really exciting, dynamic, sort of subversive work coming from that thing. And I think maybe it's sort of left subversive voices that are going to be best to fight these sort of far right subversive voices.
Paul, because obviously I'm not entirely down with the kids being a good deal older than the target age range of a man like Andrew Tate, I reached out to my nephew, who is 19, and I asked him, well, who else would you put in the same camp with Andrew Tate? And the obvious answers that immediately came back from him were the two people I was expecting, Joe Rogan and Jordan Peterson. But I then said, OK, I have those names already. If we were to take that side as a little bit of a spectrum, I'd probably put Andrew Tate at one end of it, if I were going to label him with toxic masculinity. Jordan Peterson, it seems a little bit harsh to place him in the same category as a man who's just been arrested for sex trafficking, given that he's a Canadian academic, but he is nonetheless in the same genre and space. I then said to my nephew, who else would you add on that list? And he said, Jocko Willink, who's a former US Navy SEAL, David Goggins, who's also very well known on YouTube. He then said Elon Musk and Kanye West. This is an increasingly wide pool that a 19-year-old doesn't see any distinction and difference between them. Is that going to be part of the problem here?
Yeah, definitional understandings is certainly a big problem. We seem to be throwing about a lot of terms now. I mean, my PhD research really leaned into, I mean, I harvested thousands of Facebook comments on related articles to terrorism based on Islamophobia and so on and so forth. And people espouse terminologies that they, to be fair, don't really know some definitions, and they don't really know what encompasses proper, what would traditionally be seen as maybe left-leaning politics, or by extension, then right-leaning politics. The same goes for linking Andrew Tate maybe to being like a pure, what we might understand as being incel. I don't think that he leans against that. I think he attracts incel, but I don't think that he actually is espousing of incel ideologies. Lumping again Jordan Peterson, I think, alongside the likes of Andrew Tate. I mean, Jordan Peterson he's a very smart, educated person. He doesn't need anybody else to tell him that. We might not agree, and I wouldn't. I would probably be against a lot of his potential or his views. However, at the very least, the likes of Jordan Peterson comes from a bit more of an academic perspective based on at least some level of logic. The problem with Tate is that owing to his business ventures, i.e. What used to be called Hustlers University and now the Real World, he pumps out so much content because it's financially beneficial for him and also his quote-unquote students at these online or paying him for these online courses, that he just says anything to incite. So it gets views, it gets clicks, it manipulates algorithms, and he has successfully, without even having too many social media that I can see, social media accounts in his own name, he successfully has won the medium, i.e. TikTok, for example, which means he has successfully won the narrative. So no, I don't think he's the same as a couple of others. A couple of others do follow in his steps, and we could sit here for quite some time, go on and search and list a lot of acolytes, shall we say, Sneeko. There's a few. It's not actually even a male problem. There's Layla something or another. Sorry, I'm blagging on her name, but there are quite a few that my algorithms throw up me constantly, who do the work for him, really, to spread the message, and they haven't desisted either since he has found himself inside a Romanian jail.
No, it doesn't get discussed a lot, but if we were to have been having this conversation, say, 15 or 20 years ago, it wouldn't have been Andrew Tate's name that we mentioned. It probably would have been someone like Neil Strauss. Neil Strauss, at the time, had just come out with a book that was called The Game, which was an updated version of a book by Potter from the 60s or 70s, One-Upmanship, or How to win without actually cheating. Most people might be more familiar with that as The School for Scoundrels, which was what it was turned into a film as, I think 3-4 times, something in that kind of region. So, this has been going on for quite some time. There is a female version of The Game. It's called The Rules. In your opinion, Dan, is there a female side to this? Is there a feminist Andrew Tate out there and it's just being ignored by the media? Or is this solely a male side problem? Surely anyone can be selfish and a bit of a pillock.
I mean, I think that's part of what I was getting on with my previous point in terms of the way that certain behaviours are pathologized as masculine. In terms of when we're talking about things like toxic masculinity, I think certain asinine terms that have arisen, like mansplaining, for instance, is just something that's used to describe obnoxious behaviour that can be applicable to either sex. I'm not entirely aware of a female version of Andrew Tate that's out there at the moment. I would say it's probably something that deliberately more marketed to that young sexually frustrated male market because it's probably more lucrative at the moment. I was quite interested here, echoing some of the points from Paul about that spectrum of names that came up when you asked your son about them. Certainly David Goggins is not someone who I would have put in that spectrum because he's someone who I would look at as embodying kind of potentially the positives that people might look for in Andrew Tate's work, as in looking for resilience, looking for kind of empowerment for young men. David Goggins does that, but without any of the toxicity and any of the misogyny embodied in it. So I think it was a bit unfair to lump him in there as well. But it is interesting with regard to perception, and it shows how this kind of perception can stretch. And it seems to be quite an open market. So I'll be quite sure that there probably are female equivalents out there somewhere, but I don't personally know who they are because they haven't crossed my my line of sight yet.
Marcus, as people are looking at this spectrum of different people, I've heard some people refer to this sort of genre as the manosphere. How do you see it evolving from here? What do you see coming next? The whole thing about social media is it does best when it's shocking. Once you've already had people within your particular genre being arrested for sex trafficking, where does it go from here?
I can't help but agree that, in order for the next Andrew Tate to sort of, position themselves, and I mean, obviously you see a similar thing with the Kanye West phenomenon, the only way you can do that is to sort of get worse, essentially. I mean, and again, in terms of pushing back on that, I mean, I see a vitality in the kind of subversive content coming from the left, which I would argue is more good faith content. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, all three of you, for coming in today and agreeing to talk about this topic. Remember, you can see more discussion and debate on our YouTube channel. Just head over to YouTube and search for Roundtable TRT World. But for now, from me here and the entire team, thank you for watching and goodbye.